Peace be upon you, grade 7 students. Today we will start chapter 3, Respiration of Living Things, worksheet 16, Respiratory Movement and Air Circulation. At the end of this video, you will be able to identify two phases of respiratory movement, identify the role of the diaphragm, describe the position of the intercostal muscle during each phase of respiration, define respiratory frequency, evaluate the respiratory frequency in man at rest. Prepare your science worksheet, your copybook, and a pencil. In the previous session, we learned about the organization of the human respiratory system. We were introduced to different organs that form the human respiratory system. We said that the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchus, lungs, bronchioles, and the alveoli are the organs that form the human respiratory system. Also, we learned how to trace the path of the inspired air, which is the air that enters our body. It enters from our nose. It passes through the nasal cavity, then to the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchus, bronchioles, till it reaches finally the alveoli. We will start with the first objective, which is to identify the two phases of a respiratory movement. Respiration is manifested by rhythmic movements, as we know. Let us observe this figure. What does it show? So, the direction of this arrow shows that the air is entering the human's body. So, the phase of the respiratory movement shown here is called inhalation. Now observe this figure. What does the direction of this arrow shows? The direction of this arrow shows that the air is leaving the human's body. So, this phase of respiratory movement is called exhalation. Then, inhalation and exhalation are the two phases of a respiratory movement. As we learned before that the verb identify needs justification. Then the direction of airflow allows us to identify each phase of a respiratory movement. So the two phases of a respiratory movement are inhalation and exhalation. Inhalation, which permits the entrance of air or water into the organism, while exhalation drives the air or water outside the organism. But in your opinion, which part or organ permits inhalation and exhalation? Here we're going to start with the second objective, which is to identify the role of the diaphragm. To answer this question, we built a model which represents the respiratory system. This model is made up of two balloons and an elastic membrane. To which part of the respiratory system do these balloons correspond? Yes, they correspond to the lungs. What about this elastic membrane? It corresponds to the diaphragm. Observe what will happen when he pulls the elastic membrane downward, then he pushes it upward. As the model shows that the balloons inflated when he pulls the elastic membrane downward, then when he pushes it upward, the balloons deflated. Now, are you able to identify the role of the diaphragm? Yes, so it moves upward and downward to allow the air to enter and leave the lungs. Now pause the video to answer questions number 1, 2, 3, and 4 in worksheet 16. Now it's time to check your answers. Not only the direction of airflow allows us to identify the phase of respiratory movement, if it is inhalation or exhalation, but also the position of the diaphragm is one of the ways that can be used in order to allow us to identify the phase of respiratory movement. Number 5. Indicate the phase of the respiratory movement taking place in each of the following figures, if it is inhalation or exhalation, based on the position of the diaphragm. So those two figures show different positions of the diaphragm. Observe this figure. What is the position of the diaphragm here? Is it moving downward or upward? Yes, it's downward. So what will happen with the air? Does it move inside or outside the body? Yes, it moves inside the body. So what is the phase of respiratory movement shown here? Yes, it's inhalation. Observe this figure now. What about the position of the diaphragm? Is it moving upward or downward? Yes, it's upward. What will happen to the air inside the lungs? The air will move outside the body. So, which phase is indicated here? The phase of respiratory movement here is exhalation. So, the position of the diaphragm can help us to identify the phase of respiratory movement if it is inhalation or exhalation. So based on all information, now you're able to identify the role of the diaphragm. Watch this video in order to answer number 6 in your worksheet.
So what exactly is a diaphragm? Inside your chest cavity, the diaphragm works to help your breathing. When it contracts, air fills into your lungs. When the diaphragm relaxes, it expands and forces the air out. This is how we breathe.
Now we're going to describe the position of the intercostal muscles during each phase of respiratory movement. The intercostal muscles that lie between the ribs allow the movement of the rib cage during inhalation and exhalation. To inhale air, the diaphragm contracts and moves downward, where the intercostal muscles contract, forcing the rib cage up. So the volume of the lungs increases, causing the air to be drawn in. Then the diaphragm relaxes and moves upward, where the intercostal muscles relax, forcing the rib cage down. Then the volume of the lungs decreases, causing the air to be exhaled outside the body. As we said before, that the direction of air and the position of the diaphragm can help us to identify the phase of respiratory movements. So during inhalation, the diaphragm contracts. That means it becomes tighter or smaller, and the air fills the lungs. While during exhalation, it relaxes. That means it returns to its resting position to force the air out. Also, the intercostal muscles, which lie between the ribs, can help in respiration, and their position changes during each phase. They contract to raise the rib cage in order to allow the air to fill the lungs. So, the phase of respiratory movement identified here is inhalation. While during exhalation, the intercostal muscles relax, returning to their initial position, forcing the air outside the lungs. So, the intercostal muscles contract during inhalation, while during exhalation, they relax. It's time to summarize all events that take place during inhalation and exhalation by filling the table in number 7. So, check your answers. During inhalation, the diaphragm contracts, while it relaxes during exhalation. The intercostal muscles contract during inhalation, while they relax during exhalation. The position of the rib cage rises during inhalation, while it goes down during exhalation. The volume of the lungs increases during inhalation while it decreases during exhalation. The air enters the lungs during inhalation while it leaves the lungs during exhalation. As an evaluation, match the following expressions with the appropriate term. Inhalation, the rib cage rises and the diaphragm contracts. During exhalation, the intercostal muscles relax, the volume of the lungs decreases, air leaves the body. Objective 4. Define respiratory frequency. What do we mean by respiratory frequency? It is the number of respiratory movements per minute. A respiratory movement counts as one inhale and an exhale. So if I want to know my respiratory frequency, I will count the respiratory movements during 1 minute. Now it's time to learn how to calculate the respiratory frequency. Objective number 5, evaluate the respiratory frequency in man at rest. At rest, that means without doing any activity. So put your hand on your chest while you are at rest and then count the number of breaths, which are the respiratory movements, in 1 minute. The number of respiratory movements in 1 minute are approximately 20. So the respiratory frequency in man at rest equals to approximate 20 respiratory movements per minute. Application to practice calculating the respiratory frequency. The number of respiratory movements of a man while he was jumping was 100 in 2 minutes. Calculate his respiratory frequency. First, we should write the rule. Respiratory frequency equal to the number of respiratory movements per minute, or divided by minutes, which is equal to 100 divided by 2 equals to 50 respiratory movements per minute. As a summary, the two phases of respiratory movements are inhalation and exhalation. Inhalation, which permits the entrance of air or water into the organism. Exhalation drives the air or water outside the organism. What is the role of the diaphragm and intercostal muscles? The diaphragm and the intercostal muscles permit inhalation and exhalation. Also, we learned how to identify the phase of a respiratory movement, if it is inhalation or exhalation, according to the following events. First, the direction of airflow. It is inward during inhalation. It is outward during exhalation. Second, according to the position of the diaphragm. It moves downward or contracts during inhalation, while it moves upward, relaxes during exhalation. Third, the position of the rib cage. It rises during inhalation. It lowers during exhalation. Fourth, the intercostal muscles. They contract during inhalation, while they relax during exhalation. The definition of respiratory frequency is, it is the number of respiratory movements per minute. To calculate the respiratory frequency, you should count the number of respiratory movements per 1 minute. Note that the respiratory frequency in a human changes. At rest, it was 20 respiratory movements, but it changes if you were doing any activity. Estimate your respiratory frequency while you are jumping. As an assignment, memorize the definition of respiratory frequency, memorize number 7, the table. As an activity, you can apply the model of respiration. That's all. Thanks for listening and watching. Stay safe.